Botafogo has finally reached the promised land. After a season filled with nightmares for their fans, Fogo has risen from the ashes to claim both the league title and the Libertadores in a way that couldn't have been scripted better. It's one of the most emotional football stories of the decade, and I'm here to take you through it. We'll revisit the club's illustrious past, explore their darkest days, and break down how they turned their fortunes around even after the disaster of 2023. So first, and as usual, let me give you some context. Botafogo is a historic club in Brazil. They're the oldest active sporting club in the country, having been founded as a rowing club in 1894 and as a football club in 1904. Though those apartments were two separate entities, it would take a massive tragedy to unite them. On the 11th of June 1942, the two Botafogos played against each other in a basketball match, but the result became meaningless when one of Brazil's best players, Armando Albano, suffered a lethal stroke at halftime. Even though he received medical assistance, Albano wouldn't survive, and the game was stopped right after the players were informed of his death. In that time of mourning, both Botafogo entities came to the conclusion that they were stronger together, and just 6 months later, the Botafogo you know, with a black badge and a white star, came into existence. But you see, Botafogo's history has far more accomplishments than tragic moments. For example, they're notorious for giving more players to the Brazilian national team than any other club. In the 1950s and 60s, their golden era coincided precisely with Brazil's rise and World Cup domination. Not only did Botafogo have an incredible amount of stars in their squad, but those players were also focal to Brazil's 1958 and 1962 World Cup conquests. Didi, Nilton Santos, Garrincha, Amarildo and Mário Zagallo were all part of one or both World Cup victories, which says a lot about Botafogo's level compared to other clubs in the world at the time. Obviously, with such a gifted group of players, Botafogo were able to conquer most of the trophies that are still talked about to this day. In the 1960s, Botafogo won 4 state championships and also conquered their first Brazilian league title in 1968, becoming the first club from Rio de Janeiro to do so. Botafogo lived through an era with many historic victories that appeared to have no end in sight, but this golden period wouldn't last long. In fact, their long-lasting crisis actually began in the middle of this successful era. You see, part of that dream team from the 60s was bought from other clubs. Not only were the transfers of Didi and Zagallo a big investment, but the salaries of the entire squad were also tough to manage, especially after their successes with Brazil. In order to find the necessary funds, management would book massive overseas trips where the Botafogo players clashed against the best European clubs in glorified friendlies. As a consequence, the club made a lot of money, but the players' fatigue was permanently high and their performances in official competitions were always hampered by their long trips. To make up for their failures at home, Botafogo would brand those triumphs as World Championships and mention the fact that the club was selling out stadiums and profiting a lot. But in reality, most of that cash was splurged on extravagant parties, further pushing the club into financial abyss. When Botafogo no longer possessed a title-winning team, many leeches rose to power and basically did whatever it took to remain in their position, not necessarily what Botafogo needed to succeed. I'm talking about investing in other sports such as volleyball or basketball because they had more chances of winning compared to football. Getting rid of iconic figures such as Gerson and not finding adequate replacements just to save money, never investing in the club's youth development, and the worst and most brain-dead move of them all, when the then-president Charles Borrer sold the land that the General Severiano occupied and moved the club away from its roots into Marshal Hermes. That move was a failure to say the least. If anything, the club's fortunes got even worse. The only saving grace before our current era was the arrival of Emil Pinheiro, who invested his own money into the club and led Botafogo to the 1989 state championship. But since he failed to conquer the 1992 Brasileirão, despite having arguably the best squad in the tournament, the disgruntled Botafogo members kicked him out of the club. Fogo would win the 95 championship, but at the end of the day, it was merely an underdog victory. That year, Botafogo had a relatively unknown squad, with players who might have lacked skill but made up for it with tenacity. Still, there was no intention to develop that team and the majority of players were sold just to keep their star player Tulio. However, since there was no cohesion in the team, that season ended up being a massive failure, and by the end of it, Botafogo had to sell Túlio anyway. Eventually, the millennium changed, but Botafogo's problems remained the same, if not worse. Despite having 6 different presidents in the first 20 years of the century, the club only sank deeper into ruin, with 2 relegations as a cherry on top of this shitty cake. The only highlight across all 6 presidential terms was the humility Césio Melo showed in selling the club to John Textor. Because trust me, if Botafogo hadn't become a SAF run by an investment firm, I'm pretty sure the club would have gone bankrupt. I mean, for fuck's sake, they had a debt of over 1 billion reais. Textor fixed all of their financial issues, and his impact was almost immediate. In their second season after returning from the second tier, Botafogo produced the most spectacular performance in the first half of the championship, building up a lead of 13 points over second place and winning 47 out of 57 possible points. No one had dominated the Brazilian league like that since the introduction of the current format in the early 2000s, and as an outsider, I was certain Botafogo would win the league and end their drought once and for all. But then Cristiano came calling. The Portuguese GOAT called for Luis Castro to lead his Al Nassr to Saudi glory, offering the then Botafogo manager a chance to attain generational wealth. As a football fan, it's enticing to make history with a traditional club like Botafogo, but money is power. In life, there are opportunities that just don't come knocking twice, so I think Botafogo fans probably understood his decision. Besides, all Textor had to do was find a decent enough manager to maintain their momentum, and Botafogo would likely still win the league given the massive lead they had. Except, the alternative to Luis Castro, Bruno Lage, apparently only knows how to coach Benfica. Game after game, the lead became slimmer and slimmer. Botafogo fans grew more and more impatient, so Textor decided to do what he always does. For better or for worse, listen to the supporters. In this case, that meant firing Bruno Lage. In my eyes, this was a brain-dead move. Lage wasn't perfect, he probably would have still bottled the title, but at least Botafogo would have fallen with dignity. Instead, Textor promoted a guy with no experience at the top level, completely burying the team's chances of winning the title. Later on, Thiago Nunes took over, but he didn't even win a single match until the end of the season. Ultimately, Botafogo went from having the title practically secured halfway through the season to finishing in 5th place, having won a grand total of 17 points in the second half of the season. Considering this drastic fall from grace, I assumed Botafogo wouldn't be among the top candidates to win the 2024 title. In fact, I wouldn't even be that surprised if they got relegated by the end of the year. But then, Textor started investing for real. I vividly remember being shocked when they announced the signing of Luis Henrique from Betis, and even more so when they brought in Thiago Almada. These weren't washed up stars from the past or unknown prospects from smaller clubs. These were top players who could realistically start for many Premier League clubs. At this point, I really started to wonder if Botafogo wasn't the main club in Eagles' investment holdings. As the season progressed and Textor's passion and commitment became more evident, I think that's more of a certainty than just a theory. Either way, 2 important aspects made me skeptical about Botafogo's chances of winning the league. First and foremost, their history of bottling. The team didn't change drastically. Many players from the previous season were still at the club, and the supporters were obviously the same. If the club entered a losing streak, things could sour pretty fast. Second, Artur Jorge. Despite having coached Braga, the Portuguese manager did very little to elevate the club to a new level. To be fair, he finished in 3rd place, but that happened mostly thanks to Sporting's lack of investment in the squad in 22-23. When he had a chance to achieve something great in Europe, Artur Jorge was relegated to the Europa League before being eliminated by Karabakh from Azerbaijan. Understandably, that doesn't scream success to me. But over time, Artur Jorge proved to have the perfect attitude to succeed at such a convoluted club like Botafogo. He always remained calm throughout the season, contrasting with Textor's fiery and passionate speeches. While Botafogo never dominated like they did in 2023, they also never crumbled. Look, Botafogo lost their lead in the later half of the season, and to turn the situation around, they had to top up Palmeiras, a team that only knows how to win in this decade, and Atlético Mineiro in the Libertadores final, a team that put all their chips on that title. The average manager wouldn't have been able to keep their squad focused, especially after what happened the previous year. But Artur Jorge showed the composure of an elite manager both on and off the pitch. He beat Palmeiras to open the door for a league title win after almost 30 years and won the Libertadores trophy for the first time in the club's history, all while playing with 10 men from the very beginning. Botafogo feels like a phoenix who rose from the ashes of a distant glorious past that was nothing more than that. A faded memory of a time unlikely to repeat itself. But thanks to a passionate or crazy man, depending on your perspective, Botafogo now looks like a healthy club that could be a threat to Palmeiras' long-lasting dominance. Now, only time will tell if this was a once-in-a-lifetime inspirational story or the beginning of a new dynasty in Brazil. But what do you think? Is Botafogo really the new top dog in Brazil, or will they fall back into their mediocre ways next year? Let me know what you think. And if you want to keep binging content about Brazilian football, go watch this video I made about the absolute madness that goes on in the Brazilian league every year. It's my most watched video and I'm sure you'll love it. I'll see you there.